So I'm going to restart the story just because in case we got some audio, or we had some audio problem, and yeah. I know that one person wasn't hearing the audio, so we'll just go ahead and start from the beginning. And we are reading Sherlock Holmes, adventure number 17, The Adventure of the Gloria Scott. I have some papers here, said my friend Sherlock Holmes as we sat a winter's night on either side of the fire, which I really think, Watson, it would be worth your while to glance over. These are the documents in the extraordinary case of the Gloria Scott, and this is the message which struck Justice of the Peace Trevor dead with horror when he read it. He had picked from a drawer a little tarnished cylinder, and, undoing the tape, he handed me a short note. Scrawled upon a half-sheet of slate-gray paper. The supply of game for London is going steadily up, it ran. Head Keeper Hudson, we believe, has been now told to receive all orders for flypaper and for preservation of your hen pheasant's life. As I glanced up from reading this enigmatic message, I saw Holmes chuckling at the expression upon my face. "You look a little bewildered," said he. "I cannot see how such a message as this could inspire horror. It seems to me to be rather grotesque than otherwise." "Very likely. Yet the fact remains that the reader, who was a fine, robust old man, was knocked clean down by it, as if it had been the butt end of a pistol." "You arouse my curiosity," said I. "But why did you say just now that there were very particular reasons why I should study this case?" "Because it was the first in which I was ever engaged." I had often endeavored to elicit from my companion what had first turned his mind in the direction of criminal research, but I had never caught him before in a communicative humor. Now he sat forward in his armchair and spread out the documents upon his knees. Then he lit his pipe and sat for some time smoking and turning them over. "You never heard me talk of Victor Trevor?" he asked. "He was the only friend I made during the 2 years that I was at college. I was never a very sociable fellow, Watson, always rather fond of moping in my room and working out my own little methods of thought, so that I never mixed much with the men of my year. Bar fencing and boxing, I had few athletic tastes, and then my life of study was quite distinct from that of the other fellows, so that we had no points of contact at all. Trevor was the only man I knew, and that only through the incident of his bull terrier freezing on my ankle one morning as I went down to chapel. It was a prosaic way of forming a friendship, but it was elective. I was laid by the heels for 10 days, and Trevor used to come in to inquire after me. At first it was only a minute's chat, but soon his visits lengthened, and before the end of term we were very close friends. He was a hearty, full-bodied fellow, full of spirits and energy, and very opposite to me in most respects. But we found we had some subjects in common, and it was a bond of union when I found that he was as friendless as I. Finally, he invited me down to his father's place in Donnithorpe in Norfolk, and I accepted his hospitality for a month of the long vacation. Old Trevor was evidently a man of some wealth and consideration, a J.P., and a landed proprietor. Donnithorpe is a little hamlet just to the north of Langmere, in the country of the Broads. The house was an old-fashioned, wide-spread, oak-beamed brick building with a fine lime-lined avenue leading up to it. There was an excellent wild duck shooting in the fens, remarkably good fishing, a small but select library taken over, as I understood, from a former occupant, and a tolerable cook, so that it would be a fastidious man who could not put in a pleasant month there. Trevor Sr. was a widower, and my friend was his only son. There had been a daughter, I heard, but she had died of diphtheria while on a visit to Birmingham. The father interested me extremely. He was a man of little culture, but with a considerable amount of rude strength, both physically and mentally. He knew hardly any books, but he had traveled far, had seen much of the world, and had remembered all that he had learned. In person, he was a thick-set, burly man with a stock of grizzled hair, a brown, weather-beaten face, and blue eyes which were keen to the verge of fierceness. Yet he had a reputation of kindness and charity in the countryside, and was noted for the leniency of his sentences from the bench. One evening, shortly after my arrival, we were sitting over a glass of port after dinner, when young Trevor began to talk about those habits of observation and inference, which I had already formed in a system, although I had not yet appreciated the part which they were to play in my life. The old man evidently thought that his son was exaggerating in his description of one or two trivial feats which I had performed. "Come now, Mr. Holmes," said he, laughing good-humoredly. "I'm an excellent subject, if you can deduce anything from me." "I fear there's not much yet," I answered. "I might suggest that you have gone about in fear of some personal attack within the last 12 months. The laugh faded from his lips, and he stared at me in great surprise. "Well, that's true enough," said he. "You know, Victor," turning to his son, "when we broke up that poaching game, they swore to knife us, and Sir Edward Hobby, Hoby? H-O-B-Y, has actually been attacked. I've always been on my guard since then, though I have no idea how you know it." "You have a very handsome stick," I answered. "By the inscription, I observed that you had not had it more than a year, but you have taken some pains to bore the head of it and pour melted lead into the hole, so as to make it a formidable weapon. I argued that you would not take such precautions unless you had some danger to fear." "Anything else?" he asked, smiling. "You have boxed a good deal in your youth." "Right again. How did you know it?" "Is my nose knocked a little out of the straight?" "No," said I. "It is your ears. They have the peculiar flattening and thickening which marks the boxing man." "Anything else?" "You have done a great deal of digging by your callosities." "Oh, callosities, I guess. Calluses?" Made all my money at the gold fields." "You have been in New Zealand." "Right again." "You have visited Japan." "Quite true." "And you have been most intimately associated with someone whose initials were J.A., and whom you afterwards were eager to entirely forget." Mr. Trevor stood slowly up, fixed his large blue eyes upon me with a strange, wild stare, and then pitched forward with his face among the nutshells which strewed the cloth in a dead faint. You can imagine, Watson, how shocked both his son and I were. His attack did not last long, however, for when we undid his collar and sprinkled the water from one of the finger-glasses over his face, he gave a gasp or two and sat up. "Ah, boys," he said, forcing a smile. "I hope I haven't frightened you. Strong as I look, there is a weak place in my heart, and it does not take much to knock me over. I don't know how you manage this, Mr. Holmes, but it seems to me that all the detectives of fact and of fancy would be children in your hands. That's how your line of life, sir. That's your line of life, sir, and you may take the word of a man who has seen something of the world." And that recommendation, with the exaggerated estimate of my abilities with which he prefaced it, was, if you will believe me, Watson, the very first thing which ever made me feel that a profession might be made out of what had, up to that time, been the merest hobby. In the moment, however, I was too much concerned in the sudden illness of my host to think of anything else. I hope that I have said nothing to pain you," said I. "Well, you certainly touched upon rather a tender point. May I ask how you know, and how much you know?" He spoke now in a half-jesting fashion, but a look of terror still lurked in the back of his eyes. "It is simplicity itself," said I. "When you bared your arm to draw the fish into the boat, I saw that J.A. had been tattooed in the bend of the elbow. The letters were still legible, but it was perfectly clear from the blurred appearance and from the staining of the skin round them that efforts had been made to obliterate them. It was obvious then that those initials had once been very familiar to you, and that you had afterwards wished to forget them. "What an eye you have!" he cried, with a sigh of relief. "It is just as you say, but we won't talk of it. Of all ghosts, the ghosts of our old days are the old loves are the worst. Come into the billiard room and have a quiet cigar." From that day, amid all his cordiality, there was always a touch of suspicion in Mr. Trevor's manners toward me. Even his son remarked it. "You've given the governor such a turn," said he, "that he'll never be sure again of what you know and what you don't know." He did not mean to show it, I am sure, but it was so strongly in his mind that it peeped out at every action. At last I became so convinced that I was causing him uneasiness that I drew my visit to a close. On the very day, however, before I left, an incident occurred which proved in the sequel to be of importance. We were sitting out upon the lawn on the garden chairs, and the three of us, basking in the sun and admiring the view across the Broads, when the maid came out to say that there was a man at the door who wanted to see Mr. Trevor. "What is his name?" asked my host. He would not give any. "What does he want, then?" "He says that you know him, and that he only wants a moment's conversation." "Show him round here." An instant afterwards there appeared a man, a little wizened fellow, with a cringing manner, and a shambling style of walking. He wore an open jacket with a splotch of tar on the sleeves, and a red and black check shirt, dungaree trousers, and heavy boots badly worn. His face was thin and brown and crafty, with a perpetual smile upon it, which showed an irregular line of yellow teeth, and his crinkled hands were half closed in a way that is distinctive of sailors. As he came slouching across the lawn, I heard Mr. Trevor make a sort of hiccuping noise in his throat, and jumping out of his chair, he ran into the house. He was back in a moment, and I smelt a strong reek of brandy as he passed me. "Well, my man," said he, "what can I do for you?" The sailor stood looking at him with puckered eyes, with the same loose-lipped smile upon his face. "You don't know me?" he asked. "Oh, why, dear me, it is surely Hudson," said Mr. Trevor in his tone of surprise. "Hudson it is, sir," said the seaman. "Why, it's 30 year and more since I saw you last. Here you are in your house, and me still picking my salt meat out of the harness cask. Tut, you will find that I have not forgotten old times," cried Mr. Trevor, and walking towards the sailor, he said something in a low voice. "Go into the kitchen," he continued out loud, "and I will get food and drink. I have no doubt that I shall find you a situation." "Thank you, sir," said the seaman, touching his forelock. "I'm just off a 2-year and an 8-knot tramp. Short-handed at that, and I wants a rest. I thought I'd get it better with Mr. Beddoes or with you." "Ah!" cried Mr. Trevor, "you know where Mr. Beddoes is?" "Bless you, sir, I know where all my old friends are," said the fellow with a sinister smile, and slouched off after the maid to the kitchen. Mr. Trevor mumbled something to us about having been shipmates with the man when he was going back to the diggings, and then, leaving us to the old lawn, he went indoors. An hour later, when we entered the house, we found him stretched dead drunk upon the dining-room sofa. The whole incident left a most ugly impression upon my mind, and I was not sorry next day to leave Donnithorpe behind me, for I felt that my presence must be a source of embarrassment to my friend. All this occurred during the first month of the long vacation. I went up to my London rooms, where I spent 7 weeks working out a few experiments in organic chemistry. One day, however, when the autumn was far advanced and the vacation drawing to a close, I received a telegram from my friend imploring me to return to Donnithorpe, and saying that he was in great need of my advice and assistance. Of course I dropped everything and set out for the north once more. He met me with the dog-cart at the station, and I saw at a glance that the last 2 months had been very trying ones for him. He had grown thin and careworn, and had lost the loud, cheery manner in which he had been remarkable. "The governor is dying," were the first words he said. "Impossible!" I cried. "What is the matter? Apoplexy? Nervous shock? He's been on the verge all day. I doubt if we shall find him alive." I was, as you may think, Watson, horrified at this unexpected news. "What has caused it?" I asked. That is the point. Jump in and we can talk it over while we drive. You remember that fellow who came upon the evening before you left us?" "Perfectly." "Do you know who it was that we let into the house that day?" "I have no idea." "It was the devil, Holmes!" he cried. I stared at him in astonishment. "Yes, it was the devil himself. We have not had a peaceful hour since, not one. The governor has never held up his head from that evening, and how the life has been crushed out of him and his heart broken all through this accursed Hudson." "What power had he then?" That is what I could give so much to know. The kindly, charitable, good old governor. How could he have fallen into the clutches of such a ruffian? But I am so glad that you have come, Holmes. I trust very much to your judgment and discretion, and I know that you will advise me for the best." We were dashing along the smooth, white country road when the long stretch of the Broads in front of us glimmering in the red light of the setting sun. From a grove upon our left I could already see the high chimneys and the flagstaff which marked the squire's dwelling. "My father made the fellow gardener," said my companion. My father made the fellow gardener," said my companion, "and then, as that did not satisfy him, he was promoted to the butler. The house seemed to be at his mercy, and he wandered about and did what he chose in it. The maids complained of his drunken habits and his vile language. The dad raised their wages all round to recompense for the annoyance. The fellow would take the boat and my father's best gun and treat himself to little shooting parties, and all this with such a sneering, leering, insolent face that I would have knocked him down 20 times over if he had been a man of my own age. I tell you, Holmes, I have had to keep a tight hold upon myself in this time, and now I am asking myself whether, if I had let myself go a little more, I might not have been a wiser man. Well, matters went from bad to worse with us, and this animal, Hudson, became more and more intrusive until at last, on his making some insolent reply to my father in my presence one day, I took him by the shoulder and turned him out of the room. He slunk away with a livid face and 2 venomous eyes which uttered more threats than his tongue could do. I don't know what passed between the poor dad and him after that, but the dad came to me next day and asked me whether I would mind apologizing to Hudson. I refused, as you can imagine, and asked my father how he would allow such a wretch to take such liberties with him and his household. "Ah, my boy," said he, "it is all very well to talk, but you don't know how I am placed. But you shall know, Victor. I'll see that you shall know, come what may. You wouldn't believe harm of your poor old father, would you?" He was very much moved, and shut himself up in the study all day, where I could see through the window that he was writing busily. That evening there came what seemed to me to be a grand release, for Hudson told us that he was going to leave us. He walked into the dining room as we sat after dinner and announced his intention in the thick voice of a half-drunken man. "I've had enough of Norfolk," said he. "I'll run down to Mr. Beddoes in Hampshire. He'll be as glad to see me as you are, I dare say." "You're not going away in an unkind spirit, Hudson, I hope," said my father, with a tameness which made my blood boil. "I've not had my apology," said he, sulkily glancing in my direction. "Victor, you will acknowledge that you have used this worthy fellow rather roughly," said the dad, turning to me. "On the contrary, I think that we have both shown extraordinary patience towards him, I answered. Oh, you do you? He snarled. Very good, mate. We'll see about that. He slouched out of the room, and half an hour afterwards left the house, leaving my father in a state of pitiable nervousness. Night after night I heard him pacing his room, and it was just as he was recovering his confidence that the blow did at last fall. And how? I asked eagerly. In a most extraordinary fashion. A letter arrived for my father yesterday evening, bearing the Fordingbridge postmark. My father read it, clapped both his hands to his head, and began running round the room in little circles like a man who has been driven out of his senses. When I at last drew him down onto the sofa, his mouth and eyelids were all puckered on one side, and I saw that he had had a stroke. Dr. Fordham came over at once, and we put him to bed. The paralysis had spread and has shown no sign of returning consciousness, and I think that we shall hardly find him alive. You horrify me, Trevor, I cried. What, then, could have been in this letter to cause so dreadful a result? Nothing. There lies the inexplicable part of it. The message was absurd and trivial. Oh, my God, it is as I feared. As he spoke, we came round the curve of the avenue and saw in the fading light that every blind in the house had been drawn down. As we dashed up to the door, my friend's face convulsed with grief. A gentleman in black emerged from it. When did it happen, Doctor? Asked Trevor. Almost immediately after you left. Did he recover consciousness? For an instant before the end. Any message for me? Only that the papers were in the back drawer of the Japanese cabinet. My friend ascended with the doctor to the chamber of death, while I remained in the study, turning the whole matter over and over in my head, and feeling as somber as ever I had done in my life. What was the past of this Trevor, pugilist, traveler, and gold digger, and how had he placed himself in the power of this acid-faced seaman? Why, too, should he faint at an allusion to the half-effaced initials upon his arm, and die of fright when he had a letter from Fordingbridge? Come on, Snockings. Stop being a pest. Get in my lap or go away. Sorry. Come on. I have a lap. Stop hovering. Come on. Am I going to have to lift you onto my lap? Come on. Okay, Snockings is going to be a pain. I apologize in advance for anything that happens. Why, too, should he faint in an allusion to the half-effaced initials upon his arm and die of fright when he had a letter for Fordingbridge? Then I remembered that Fordingbridge was in Hampshire, and that this Mr. Beddoes, whom the seaman had gone to visit, and presumably to blackmail, had also been mentioned as living in Hampshire. The letter, then, might either come from Hudson the seaman, saying that he had betrayed the guilty secret which appeared to exist, or it might come from Beddoes, warning an old confederate that such a betrayal was imminent. So far it seemed clear enough. But then, how could the letter be trivial and grotesque, as described by the Sun? He must have misread it. If so, it must have been one of those ingenious secret codes which mean one thing while they seem to mean another. I must see this letter. If there were a hidden meaning in it, I was confident that I could pluck it forth. For an hour I sat pondering over in the gloom, until at last a weeping maid brought in a lamp, and close at her heels came my friend Trevor, pale but composed, with these very papers which lie upon my knee held in his grasp. He sat down opposite to me, drew the lamp to the edge of the table, and handed me a short note scribbled, as you see, upon a single sheet of grey paper. The supply of game for London is going steadily up, it ran. Headkeeper Hudson, we believe, has been now told to receive all orders for flypaper and for preservation of your hen pheasant's life. I dare say my face looked as bewildered as yours did just now when first I read this message. Then I reread it very carefully. It was evidently as I thought, and some second meaning must lie buried in this strange combination of words. Or could it be that there was a prearranged significance to such phrases as flypaper and hen pheasant? Such a meaning would be arbitrary and could not be deduced in any way. And yet I was loath to believe that this was the case, and the presence of the word Hudson seemed to show that the subject of the message was as I had guessed, and that it was from Beddoes rather than the sailor. I tried it backwards, but the combination life, pheasants, hen was not encouraging. Then I tried alternate words, but neither the of for nor supply game London promised to throw any light upon it. And then, in an instant, the key of the riddle was in my hands, and I saw that every third word beginning with the first would give a message which might well drive old Trevor to despair. It was short and terse, the warning, as I now read it to my companion. The game is up. Hudson has told all. Fly for your life. Victor Trevor sank his face into his shaking hands. It must be that, I suppose, said he. This is worse than death, for it means disgrace as well. What is the meaning of this? Gamekeepers and hen pheasants. It means nothing to the message, but it might mean a good deal to us if we had no other means of discovering the sender. You see that he had begun by writing the game is, and so on. Afterwards, he had to fulfill the prearranged cipher to fill in any two words in each place. He would naturally use the first words which came to his mind, and if there were so many which referred to sport among them, you may be tolerably sure that he is either an ardent shot or interested in breeding. So do you know anything of this, Beddoes? Why, now that you mention it, said he, I remember that my old poor father used to have an invitation from him to shoot over his preserves every autumn. Then it is undoubtedly from him that the note comes, said I. It only remains for us to find out what this secret was which the sailor Hudson seems to have held over the heads of those two wealthy and respectable men. Alas, Holmes, I fear that it is one of sin and shame, cried my friend. But for you I shall have no secret. Here is the statement which was drawn up by my father when he knew that the danger from Hudson had become imminent. I found it in the Japanese cabinet, as he told the doctor. Take it and read it to me, for I have neither the strength nor the courage to do it myself. These are the very papers, Watson, which he handed to me, and I will read them to you as I read them in the old study that night to him. They were endorsed outside, as you can see. Some particulars of the voyage of the Gloria Scott, from her leaving Falmouth on the 8th October, 1855, to her destruction in north latitude 15 degrees, 20 minutes, west long 25 and 14, on November 16th. It is in the form of a letter, and runs in this way. My dear, dear son, now that the approaching disgrace begins to darken the closing years of my life, I can write with all truth and honesty that it is not the terror of the law, it is not the loss of my position in the country, nor is it my fall in the eyes of all who have known me, which cuts me to the heart. But it is the thought that you should come to blush for me, you who love me, and who have seldom, I hope, had reason to do other than respect me. But it is the blow, but if the blow falls, which is for ever hanging over me, then I should wish you to read this, that you may know straight from me how far I have been to blame. On the other hand, if all should go well, which may kind God Almighty grant, Then if by any chance this paper should be still undestroyed, and should fall into your hands, I conjure you by all you hold sacred, by the memory of your dear mother, and by the love which has been between us, to hurl it into the fire, and to never give one thought to it again. If then your eye goes on to read this line, I know that I shall already have been exposed and dragged from my home, or, as is more likely, for you to know that my heart is weak, be lying with my tongue sealed forever in death. In either case, the time for suppression is past, and every word which I tell you is the naked truth, and this I swear as I hope for mercy. My name, dear lad, is not Trevor. It was James Armitage in my younger days, and you can understand how the shock that it was to me a few weeks ago when your college friend addressed me in words which seemed to imply that he had surmised my secret. As Armitage it was that I entered a London banking house, and as Armitage I was convicted of breaking my country's laws and once sentenced to transportation. Do not think very harshly of me, laddie. It was a debt of honor, so called, which I had to pay, and I used money which was not my own to do it, in the certainty that I could replace it before there could be any possibility of it being missing. But the most dreadful ill luck pursued me. The money which I had reckoned upon never came to hand, and a premature examination of accounts exposed my deficit. The case might have been dealt leniently with, but the laws were more harshly administered 30 years ago than now, and on my 23rd birthday I found myself chained as a fellow. I found myself chained as a felon with 37 other convicts in the decks of the barque Gloria Scott, bound for Australia. It was the year 55 when the Crimean War was at its height, and the old convict ships had been largely used as transports in the Black Sea. The government was compelled, therefore, to use smaller and less suitable vessels for sending out their prisoners. The Gloria Scott had been in the Chinese tea trade, but she was an old-fashioned, heavy-bowed, broad-beamed craft, and the new clippers had cut her out. She was a 500-ton boat, and besides her 28 gaol-birds, she carried 26 of the crew, 18 soldiers, a captain, 3 mates, a doctor, a chaplain, and 4 warders. Nearly 100 souls were in her all told, when we set sail for Falmouth. The partitions between the cells and the convicts, instead of being a thick oak, as it is usual in convict ships, were quite thin and frail. The man next to me upon the aft side was one whom I had particularly noticed when we were led down the quay. He was a young man with a clear, hairless face, a long, thin nose, and rather nutcracker jaws. He carried his head very jauntily in the air, had a swaggering style of walking, and was, above all else, remarkable for his extraordinary height. I don't think any of our heads would come up to his shoulders, and I am sure that he could not have measured less than 6.5 feet. It was strange among so many sad and weary faces to see one which was full of energy and resolution. The sight of it was, to me, like a fire in the snowstorm. I was glad then to find that he was a neighbor, and gladder still when, in the dead of the night, I heard a whisper close to my ear, and found that he had managed to cut an opening in the board which separated us. "Hullo, chummy," said he. "What's your name, and what are you here for?" I answered him, and he asked in turn who I was talking with. "I'm Jack Pendergast," said he, "and by God you'll learn to bless my name before you've done with me." I remembered hearing of his case, for it was one which had made an immense sensation throughout the country some time before my own arrest. He was a man of good family and of great ability, but of incurably vicious habits, who had, by an ingenious system of fraud, obtained huge sums of money from the leading London merchants. "Aha, you remember my case," said he proudly. "Very well indeed." "Then maybe you remember something queer about it?" "What was that, then?" "I'd had nearly $250,000, hadn't I?" "So it was said. But none was recovered, eh?" "No." "Well, where do you suppose the balance is?" he asked. "I have no idea," said I. "Right between my finger and thumb," he cried. "By God, I've got more pounds in my name than you have hairs on your head. And if you've money, my son, and know how to handle it and spread it, you can do anything. Now, you don't think it likely that a man who could do anything is going to wear his breeches out sitting in the stinking hold of a rat-gutted, beetle-ridden, moldy old coffin of a China coaster? No, sir, such a man will look after himself, and will look after his chums. You may lay to that. You hold on to him, and you may kiss the book that he'll haul you through." That was his style of talk, and at first I thought it meant nothing, but after a while, when he had tested me and sworn me in with all possible solemnity, he let me understand that there really was a plot to gain command of the vessel. A dozen of the prisoners had hatched it before they came aboard. Pendergast was the leader, and his money was the motive power. I'd a partner," he said, "a rare good man, as true as a stock to a barrel. He's got the dibs, he has, and where do you think he is at this moment? Why, he's the chaplain of this ship, the chaplain, no less. He came aboard with a black coat and his papers right, and the money enough in his box to buy the thing right up from keel to mainstruck. The crew are his, body and soul. He could buy 'em all so much a gross with a cash discount, and he did it before ever they signed on. He's got 2 of the warders and Mercer, the second mate, and he's got the captain himself if he thought him worth it." "What are we to do, then?" I asked. "What do you think?" said he. "We'll make the coats of some of these soldiers redder than ever the tailor did." "But they are armed," said I. "And so shall we be, my boy. There's a brace of pistols for every mother's son of us, and if we can't carry this ship with a crew at our back, it's time we were all sent to a young Mrs. boarding school. You speak to your mate on the left tonight, and see if he is to be trusted." I did so, and found my other neighbor to be a young fellow in much the same position as myself, whose crime had been forgery. His name was Evans, but he afterwards changed it, like myself, and he is now a rich and prosperous man in the south of England. He was ready enough to join the conspiracy as the only means of saving ourselves, and before we had crossed the bay, there were only 2 of the prisoners who were not in the secret. One of these was of weak mind, and we did not dare to trust him. The other was suffering from jaundice, and could not be of any use to us. From the beginning, there was really nothing to prevent us taking possession of the ship. The crew were a set of ruffians especially picked for the job. The sham chaplain came into our cells to exhort us, carrying a black bag supposed to be full of tracts, and so often did he come that by the 3rd day we had each stowed away at the foot of our bed a file, a brace of pistols, a pound of powder, and 20 slugs. 2 of the warders were agents of Pendergast, and the second mate was his right-hand man. The captain, the 2 mates, 2 warders, Lieutenant Martin, his 18 soldiers, and the doctor were all that we had against us. Yet, safe as it was, we determined to neglect no precaution, and to make our attack suddenly at night. It came, however, more quickly than we expected, and in this way. One evening, about the 3rd week after our start, the doctor had come down to see one of the prisoners, who was ill, and, putting his hand down in the bottom of his bunk, he felt the outline of the pistol. If he had been silent, he might have blown the whole thing, but he was a nervous little chap, so he gave a cry of surprise and turned so pale that the man knew what was up in an instant and seized him. He was gagged before he could give the alarm, and tied down upon the bed. He had unlocked the door that led to the deck, and we were through it in a rush. The 2 sentries were shot down, and so was a corporal who came running to see what was the matter. There were 2 more soldiers at the door of the stateroom, and their muskets seemed not to be loaded, for they never fired upon us, and they were shot while trying to fix their bayonets. Then we rushed on into the captain's cabin, but as we pushed open the door, there was an explosion from within, and there he lay with his head on his chest of the Atlantic, which was pinned upon the table, while the chaplain stood with a smoking pistol in his hand at his elbow. The 2 mates had both been seized by the crew, and the whole business seemed to be settled. The stateroom was next to the cabin, and we flocked in there and flopped down on the settees, all speaking together, for we were just mad with the feeling that we were free once more. There were lockers all round, and Wilson, the sham chaplain, knocked one of them in and pulled out a dozen of brown sherry. We cracked off the necks of the bottles, poured the stuff into our tumblers, and we were just tossing them off when in an instant, without warning, there came the roar of muskets in our ears, and the saloon was so full of smoke that we could not see across the table. When it cleared again, the place was a shambles. Wilson and 8 others were wriggling on the top of each other on the floor, and the blood and the brown sherry on that table turned me sick now that I think of it. We were so cowed by the sight that I think we should have given the job up, if it had not been for Pendergast. He bellowed like a bull and rushed for the door with all that were left alive in his heels. Out we ran, and there on the poop were the lieutenant and 10 of his men. The swing skylights above the saloon table had been a bit open, and they had fired on us through the slit. We got on them before they could load, and they stood to it like men. But we had the upper hand of them, and in 5 minutes it was all over. My God, was there ever a slaughterhouse like that ship? Pendergast was like a raging devil, and he picked the soldiers up as if they had been children, and threw them overboard, alive or dead. There was no sergeant that was there was one sergeant that was horribly wounded, and they kept on swimming for a surprising time, until someone in mercy blew out his brains. Then the fighting was over, and there was no one left of our enemies except just the warders, the mates, and the doctor. It was over them that the great quarrel arose. There were many of us who were glad enough to win back our freedom, and yet who had no wish to have murder on their souls. It was one thing to knock the soldiers over with their muskets in their hands, and it was another to stand by while men were being killed in cold blood. 80 of us, 5 convicts and 3 sailors, said that we would not see it done. But there was no moving Pendergast and those who were with him. Our only job of safety lay in making a clean job of it, said he, and he would not leave a tongue with power to wag in a witness box. It nearly came to our sharing the fate of the prisoners, but at last he said that if we wished, we might take a boat and go. We jumped at the offer, for we were already sick of these bloodthirsty doings, and we saw that there would be worse doings before it was done. We were given a suit of sailors' togs each, a barrel of water, 2 casks, one of junk and one of biscuits, and a compass. Pendergast threw us over a chart, told us that we were shipwrecked mariners whose ship had foundered. Foundered at latitude 15 north and long 15 west, and then cut the painters and let us go. And now I come to the most surprising part of my story, my dear son. The seaman who hauled the foreyard aback during the rising. But as we left them, they brought it square again, and as there was a light wind from the north and east, the bark began to draw slowly away from us. Our boat lay rising and falling upon the long, smooth rollers, and Evans and I, who were the most educated of the party, were sitting in the sheets working out our position and planning what coast we should make for. It was a nice question for the Cape de Verds. It was a nice question, for the Cape de Verds were about 500 miles to the north of us, and the African coast about 700 miles to the east. On the whole, as the wind was coming round to north, we thought that Sierra Leone might be best, and turned our head in that direction, the bark being at that time nearly hull down on our starboard quarter. Suddenly, as we looked at her, we saw a dense black cloud of smoke shoot up from her, which hung like a monstrous tree upon the skyline. A few seconds later, a roar like thunder burst away our ears, and as the smoke thinned away, there was no sign left of the Gloria Scott. In an instant we swept the boat's head round again, and pulled with all our strength for the place where the haze, still trailing over the water, marked the scene of this catastrophe. It was a long hour before we reached it, and at first we feared that we had come too late to save anyone. A splintered boat and a number of crates and fragments of spars rising and falling in the waves showed us where the vessel had foundered. But there was no sign of life, and we had turned away in despair when we heard a cry for help, and saw at some distance a piece of wreckage with a man lying outstretched across it. When we pulled him aboard the boat, he proved to be a young seaman with the name of Hudson, who was so burned and exhausted that he could give us no account of what had happened until the following morning. It seemed that after we had left, Pendergast and his gang had proceeded to put to death the 5 remaining prisoners. The 2 warders had been shot and thrown overboard, and so also had the 3rd mate. Pendergast, when descended into the 'tween decks, and with his own hands cut the throat of the unfortunate surgeon. There only remained the 1st mate, who was a bold and active man. When he saw the convict approach him with a bloody knife in his hand, he kicked off his bonds, which he had somehow contrived to loosen, and rushed down the deck. He plunged into the afterhold. A dozen convicts who descended with their pistols in search of him found him with a matchbox in his hand, seated beside an open powder barrel, which was one of the 100 carried on board, and swearing that he would blow all hands up if he were in any way molested. An instant later the explosion occurred, though Hudson thought that it was caused by the misdirected bullet of one of the convicts, rather than the mate's match. But be the cause what it may, it was the end of the Gloria Scott, and of the rabble who held command of her. Such, in a few words, my dear boy, is the history of this terrible business in which I was involved. Next day we were picked up by the brig Hotspur, bound for Australia, whose captain found no difficulty in believing that we were the survivors of the passenger ship which was foundered. The transport ship Gloria Scott was set down by the Admiralty as being lost at sea, and no word was ever leaked out as to her true fate. After an excellent voyage, the Hotspur landed us at Sydney, where Evans and I changed our names, and made our way to the diggings, where, among the crowds who were gathered from all nations, we had no difficulty in losing our former identities. The rest I need not relate. We protested, we traveled, we came back as rich, we prospered, we traveled, we came back as rich colonials to England, and we bought country estates. For more than 20 years we have led peaceful and useful lives, and we hope that our past was forever buried. Imagine, then, my feelings when in the seamen who came to us I recognized instantly the man who had been picked off the wreck. He had tracked us down somehow, and had set himself to live upon our fears. You would understand now how it was that I strove to keep peace with him, and you will in some measure sympathize with me in the fears which fill me now that he has gone from me to his other victim, with threats upon his tongue. Underneath is written in a hand so shaky as to be hardly legible, Beddoes writes in cipher to say that H has told all. Sweet Lord, have mercy on our souls. That was the narrative which I read that night to young Trevor, and I think, Watson, that under the circumstances it was the dramatic one. The good fellow was heartbroken at it, and went out to the Terria tea plant, where I hear that he is doing well. As to the sailor and Beddoes, neither of them was ever heard of again after that day on which the letter of warning was written. They both disappeared utterly and completely. No complaint had been lodged with the police, so that Beddoes was mistaken a threat for a deed. Hudson had been seen lurking about, and it was believed by the police that he had done away with Beddoes and fled. For myself, I believe that the truth was exactly the opposite. I think that it is most probable that Beddoes, pushed to desperation and believing himself to have been already betrayed, had revenged himself upon Hudson, and had fled from the country, with as much money as he could lay his hands on. Those are the facts of the case, Doctor, and if they are of any use to your collection, I am sure that they are very heartily at your service. Yeah, I'm surprised that I've not seen a movie of this friendship. Of course, we have young Sherlock. Oh, that's the end of the story, by the way. Of course, we have young Sherlock, which is him at secondary school, I guess that would be. With, of course, child Watson, which they were never friends then. What? Snockings, please be quiet. I'm sorry about all the Snockings yowling. And I'm sorry about all these dropped frames. Would you please... Okay, come into my lap. Come on. Snockings. You're being a nuisance again. Come on. Come on, Snockings. Oh, you are very annoying. Okay. Well, I'm holding her for now, so she may be quiet for a little bit. Anyways, let us continue on with our second adventure today. It's going to be Adventure 18, The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual. An anomaly which often struck me in the character of my friend Sherlock Holmes was that, although in his methods of thought he was the neatest and most methodical of mankind, and although also he affected a certain quiet primness of dress, he was nonetheless in his personal habits one of the most untidy men that ever drove a fellow lodger to distraction. Not that I am in the least conventional in that respect myself, the rough-and-tumble work in Afghanistan coming on the top of a natural bohemianism of disposition has made me rather more lax than befits a medical man. But with me there is a limit, and when I find a man who keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe end of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondences transfixed by a jackknife into the very center of his wooden mantelpiece, then I begin to give myself virtuous airs. I have always held, too, that pistol practice should distinctly be an open-air pastime, and when Holmes, in one of his queer humors, would sit in his armchair with his hair trigger and 100 Boxer cartridges and proceed to adorn the opposite wall with a patriotic V.R. done in bullet pockets, I felt strongly that neither the atmosphere nor the appearance of our room was improved by it. Our chambers were always full of chemicals and criminal relics, which had a way of wandering into the unlikely positions and of turning up in the butter dish, or in even less desirable places. But his papers were my great crux. He had a horror of destroying documents, especially those which were connected with his past cases, and yet it was only once in every year or two that he would muster energy to docket and arrange them, for, as I have mentioned somewhere in these incoherent memoirs, the outbursts of passionate energy when he performed the remarkable feats with which he named his associate, with which his name is associated, were followed by reactions of lethargy, during which he would lie about with his violin and his books, hardly moving save from the sofa to the table. Thus, month after month, his papers accumulated until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles of manuscripts, which were on no account to be burned, and which could not be put away save their owner. Wow, Sherlock Holmes is a hoarder. One winter's night, as we sat together by the fire, I ventured to suggest to him that as he had finished pasting extracts into his commonplace book, he might employ the next 2 hours in making our room a little more habitable. He could not deny the justice of my request, so with a rather rueful face, he went off to his bedroom, from which he returned presently, pulling a large tin box behind him. This he placed in the middle of the floor, and squatting down upon a stool in front of it, he threw back the lid. I could see that it was already a third full of bundles of paper tied up with red tape into separate packages. "There are cases enough here, Watson," said he, looking at me with mischievous eyes. "I think that if you knew all that I had in this box, you would ask me to pull some out instead of putting others in." "These are the records of your early work, then?" I asked. "I have often wished that I had notes of other cases." "Yes, my boy, these are all done prematurely before my biographer had come to glorify me." He lifted bundle after bundle in a tender, caressing sort of way. "They are not all successes, Watson," said he, "but there are some pretty little problems among them. Here's the record of the Tarleton murders, and the case of Banbury, the wine merchant, and the adventures of the old Russian woman, and the singular affair of the aluminum crutch, as well as a full account of Ricoletti of the clubfoot, and his abominable wife. And here, now, this really is something a little recherché, I think, refound." He dived his arm down to the bottom of the chest and brought up a small wooden box with a sliding lid, such as children's toys are kept in. From within he produced a crumpled piece of paper and an old-fashioned brass key, a peg of wood with a ball of string attached to it, and 3 rusty old discs of metal. "Well, my boy, what do you make of this lot?" he asked, smiling at my expression. "It is a curious collection." "Very curious, and the story that hangs round it will strike you as being more curious still." "These relics have a history, then?" "So much that they are history." "What do you mean by that?" Sherlock Holmes picked them up one by one and laid them along the edge of the table. Then he reseated himself in his chair and looked them over with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "These," said he, "are all that I have left to remind me of the adventures of the Musgrave ritual." I had heard him mention the case more than once, though I had never been able to gather the details. "I should be so glad," said I, "if you would give me an account of it." "And leave the litter as it is," he cried mischievously. "Your tidiness won't bear much strain after all, Watson. But I should be glad that you should add this case to your annals, for these are points in which make it quite unique in the criminal records of this, or, I believe, of any other country. A collection of my trifling achievements would certainly be incomplete, which contained no account of this very singular business. Oh, crafty Holmes getting out of housework. You may remember now the affair of the Gloria Scott, and my conversations with the unhappy man whose fate I told you of first turned my attention in the direction of the profession which has become my life's work. You see me now, when my name has become known far and wide, and when I am generally recognized both by the public and by the official force as being a final court of appeals in doubtful cases. Even when you knew me first, at the time of the affair which you have commemorated in Study in Scarlet, I had already established a considerable, though not a very lucrative, connection. You can hardly realize, then, how difficult I found it at first, and how long I had to wait before I succeeded in making any headway. When I first came up to London, I had rooms in Montague Street, just round the corner from the British Museum, and there I waited, filled in my too abundant leisure time by studying all those branches of science which might make me more efficient. Now and again cases came in my way, principally through the introduction of old fellow students, for during my last years at the university there was a good deal of talk there about myself and my methods. The third of these cases was that of the Musgrave ritual, and it is to the interest which was aroused by that singular chain of events, and the large issues which proved to be at stake, that I traced my first stride toward the position which I now hold. Reginald Musgrave has been in the same college as myself, and I had some slight acquaintance with him. He was not generally popular among the undergraduates, though it always seemed to me that which was set down as pride was really an attempt to cover extreme natural diffidence. In appearance, he was a man of exceedingly aristocratic type, thin, high-nosed, and large-eyed, with languid and yet courtly manners. He was indeed a scion of one of the very oldest families in the kingdom, though his branch was a cadet one, which had He was indeed a scion of one of the very oldest families in the kingdom, though his branch was a cadet one, which had separated from the northern Musgraves some time in the 16th century, and had established itself in western Sussex, where the manor house of the Hurlstone is perhaps the oldest inhabited building in the country. Something of his birthplace seemed to cling to the man, and I never looked at his pale, keen face or the poise of his head without associating him with great archways and mullioned windows and all the venerable wreckage of the feudal keep. Once or twice we drifted into talk, and I can remember that more than once he expressed a keen interest in my methods of observation and inference. For 4 years I had seen nothing of him until one morning he walked into my room in Montague Street. He had changed a little, was dressed like a young man of fashion, he was always a bit of a dandy, and preserved the same quiet, suave manner which had formerly distinguished him. "How has all gone with you, Musgrave?" I asked, after he had cordially shaken hands. "You probably heard of my poor father's death," said he. "He was carried off about 2 years ago. Since then I have, of course, had the Hurlstone estate to manage, and as I am member of my district as well, my life has been a busy one, but I understand, Holmes, that you are turning to practical ends those powers with which you used to amaze us." "Yes," said I. "I have taken up living by my wits. I am delighted to hear it, for your advice at present would be exceedingly valuable to me. We have had some very strange doings in Hurlstone, and the police have been able to throw no light upon the matter. It is really the most extraordinary and inexplicable business." You can imagine with what eagerness I listened to him, Watson, for the very chance for which I had been panting during all those months of inaction seemed to have come within my reach. In my inmost heart I believed that I could succeed where others failed, and now I had the opportunity to test myself. "Pray let me have the details," I cried. Reginald Musgrave sat down opposite to me and lit the cigarette which I had pushed towards him. "You must know," said he, "that though I am a bachelor, I have to keep up a considerable staff of servants at Hurlstone, for it is a rambling old place, and takes a good deal of looking after. I preserve two, and in the pheasant month, I preserve two, and in the pheasant's months I usually have a house party, so that it would not do to be short-handed. Altogether there are 8 maids, the cook, the butler, 2 footmen, and a boy. The garden and the stables, of course, have a separate staff. Of these servants, the ones who had been longest in our service was Bunton, the butler. He was a young schoolmaster, out of place when he was first taken up by my father, but he was a man of great energy and character, and he soon became quite invaluable in the household. He was a well-grown, handsome man with a splendid forehead, and though he had been with us for 20 years, he cannot have been more than 40 now. With his personal advantages and his extraordinary gifts, for he can speak several languages and play nearly every musical instrument it is wonderful that he should have been satisfied so long in such a position. But I suppose that he was comfortable and lacked energy to make any change. The butler of Hurlstone is always a thing that is remembered by all who visit us. But this paragon has one fault. He is a bit of a Don Juan, and you can imagine that for a man like him it is not a very difficult part to play in a quiet country district. When he was married it was all right, but since he has been a widower we have had no end of trouble with him. A few months ago we were in hopes that he was about to settle down again, for he became engaged to Rachel Howells, our second housemaid, but he has thrown her over since then and taken up with Janet Tregellis, the daughter of the head gamekeeper. Rachel, who was a very good girl, but of an excitable Welsh temperament, had a sharp tongue of brain fever, and goes about the house now, or did until yesterday, like a black-eyed shadow of her former self. That was our first drama at Hurlstone, but the second one came to drive it from our minds, and it was prefaced by the disgrace and dismissal of Butler Brunton. This is how it came about. I have said that the man was intelligent, and this very intelligence has caused his ruin, for it seems to have led to an insatiable curiosity about things which did not in the least concern him. I had no idea of the lengths to which this would carry him until the merest accident opened my eyes to it. I have said that the house is a rambling one. One night last week, on Thursday night to be more exact, I found that I could not sleep, having foolishly taken a cup of strong café noir after my dinner. After struggling against it until 2 in the morning, I felt that it was quite hopeless, so I rose and lit the candle with the intention of continuing a novel which I was reading. The book, however, had been left in the billiard-room, so I pulled on my dressing-gown and started off to get it. In order to reach the billiard-room, I had to descend a flight of stairs, and then to cross the head of a passage which led to the library and the gun-room. You can imagine my surprise when I was looking down this corridor and saw a glimmer of light coming from the open door in the library. I had myself extinguished the lamp and closed the door before coming to bed. Naturally, my first thought was of burglars. The corridors at Hurlstone have their walls largely decorated with trophies of old weapons. From one of these I picked a battle-axe, and then, leaving my candle behind me, I crept on tiptoe down the passage and peeped in at the open door. Brunton, the butler, was in the library. He was sitting fully dressed in an easy-chair, with a slip of paper which looked like a map upon his knee, and his forehead sunk forward upon his hand in deep thought. I stood dumb with astonishment, watching him from the darkness. A small taper in the end of the table shed a feeble light, which sufficed to show me that he was fully dressed. Suddenly, as I looked, he rose from the chair and walked over to a bureau at the side. He unlocked it and drew out one of the drawers. From this he took a paper, and returning to his seat, he flattened it out beside the taper on the end of the table, and began to study it with minute attention. My indignation at this calm examination of our family documents overcame me so far that I took a step forward, and Brunton looked up, saw me standing in the doorway. He sprang to his feet, his face turned livid with fear, and he thrust into his breast the chart-like paper which he had been originally studying. "So," said I, "this is how you repay the trust which we have reposed in you. You will leave my service tomorrow." He bowed with the look of a man who was utterly crushed, and slunk past me without a word. The taper was still in the table, and by its light I glanced to see what the paper was which Brunton had taken from the bureau. To my surprise, it was nothing of any importance at all, but simply a copy of the questions and answers in a singular old observation called the Musgrave Ritual. It is a sort of ceremony particular to our family, which each Musgrave for centuries past has gone through upon his coming of age, a thing of private interest and perhaps of some little importance to the archaeologist, like our own blazonings and charges, but of no particular practical use whatever. "We had better come back to the paper afterwards," said I. "If you think it really necessary," he answered with some hesitation. To continue my statement, however, I relocked the bureau, using the key which Brunton had left, and I had turned to go, when I was surprised to find that the butler had returned and was standing before me. "Mr. Musgrave, sir," he cried in a voice which was hoarse with emotion, "I can't bear disgrace, sir. I've always been proud above my station in life, and disgrace would kill me. My blood will be on your head, sir. It will indeed, if you drive me to despair. If you cannot keep me after what has passed, then for God's sake let me give you notice the least in a month, and leave in a month, as if of my own free will. I could stand that, Mr. Musgrave, but not to be cast out before all the folk that I know so well." "You don't deserve much consideration, Brunton," I answered. "Your conduct has been most infamous. However, as you have been a long time in the family, I have no wish to bring public disgrace upon you. A month, however, is too long. Take yourself away in a week, and give what reason you like for going." "Only a week, sir," he cried in a despairing voice. "A fortnight. Say at least a fortnight." "A week," I repeated, "and you may consider yourself to have been very leniently dealt with." He crept away, his face sunk upon his breast, like a broken man, while I put on my light and returned to my room. For 2 days after this, Brunton was more assiduous in his attention to his duties. I made no allusion to what had passed, and waited with some curiosity to see how he would cover his disgrace. On the third morning, however, he did not appear, as was his custom after breakfast, to receive my instructions for the day. As I left the dining room, however, I happened to meet Rachel Howells, the maid. I have told you that she has only recently recovered from an illness, and was looking so wretchedly pale and wan that I remonstrated with her for being at work. "You should be in bed," said I. "Come back to your duties when you are stronger." She looked at me with so strange an expression that I began to suspect that her brain was affected. "I am strong enough, Mr. Musgrave," said she. "We will see what the doctor says," I answered. "You must stop work now, and when you go downstairs, just say that I wish to see Brunton." "The butler is gone," said she. "Gone? Gone where?" "He is gone. No one has seen him. He is not in his room. Oh, yes, he is gone. He is gone!" She fell back against the wall with shriek after shriek of laughter, while I, horrified at this sudden hysterical attack, rushed to the bell to summon help. The girl was taken to her room, still screaming and sobbing, while I made inquiries about Brunton. There was no doubt about it that he was disappeared. His bed had not been slept in. He had been seen by no one since he had retired to his room the night before, and yet it was difficult to see how he could have left the house, as both windows and doors were found to be fastened in the morning. His clothes, his watch, and even his money were in his room, but the black suit which he usually wore was missing. His slippers, too, were gone, but his boots were left behind. Where, then, could Butler Brunton have gone in the night, and what could have become of him now? Of course, we searched the house from cellar to garret, but there was no trace of him. It is, as I have said, a labyrinth of an old house, especially the original wing, which is now practically uninhabited, but we ransacked every room and cellar without discovering the least sign of the missing man. It was incredible to me that he could have gone away, leaving all his property behind him, and yet where could he be? I called in the local police, but without success. Rain had fallen on the night before, and we examined the lawn and the paths all round the house, but in vain. Matters were in this state when a new development quite drew our attention away from the original mystery. For 2 days Rachel Howells had been so ill, sometimes delirious, sometimes hysterical, that a nurse had been employed to sit up with her at night. On the third night after Brunton's disappearance, the nurse, finding her patient sleeping nicely, had dropped into a nap in the armchair, when she woke in the early morning to find the bed empty, the window open, and no signs of the invalid. I was instantly aroused, and with the 2 footmen started off at once in search of the missing girl. It was not difficult to tell the direction which she had taken, for, starting from under the window, we could follow her footmarks easily across the lawn to the edge of the mere, where they vanished close to the gravel path which leads out of the grounds. The lake there is 8 feet deep, and you can imagine our feelings when we saw that the trail of the poor demented girl came to an end at the edge of it. Of course, we had the drags at once, and set to work to recover the remains, but no trace of the body could we find. On the other hand, we brought to the surface an object of the most unexpected kind. It was a linen bag which contained within it a mass of old rusted and discolored metal, and several dull-colored pieces of pebble or glass. This strange find was all that we could get from the mere, and although we made every possible search and inquiry yesterday, we knew nothing of the fate either of Rachel Howells or Richard Brunton. The country police were at their wits' end, and I have come up to you at last, as a last resort. You can imagine, Watson, that with what eagerness I listened to this extraordinary sequence of events, and endeavored to piece them together, and to devise some common thread upon which they might all hang. The butler was gone. The maid was gone. The maid had loved the butler, but had afterwards had cause to hate him. She was of Welsh blood, fiery and passionate. She had been terribly excited immediately after his disappearance. She had clung into the lake a bag containing some curious contents. These were all factors which had to be taken into consideration, and yet none of them got quite to the heart of the matter. What was the starting point of this chain of events? There lay the end of my tangled line. "I must see that paper, Musgrave," said I, "which this butler of yours thought it worth his while to consult, even at the risk of the loss of his place. "It is rather an absurd business, this ritual of ours," he answered, "but it has at least the saving grace of antiquity to excuse it. I have a copy of the questions and answers here, if you dare to run your eye over them." He handed me the very paper which I have here, Watson, and this is the strange catechism to which each Musgrave had to submit when he came to the man's estate. I will read you the questions and answers as they stand. Who was it? His who is gone. Who shall it have? Who shall have it? He who will come. Where was the sun? Over the oak. Where was the shadow? Under the elm. How has it stepped? North by 10 and by 10, east by 5 and by 5, south by 2 and by 2, west by 1 and by 1, and so under. What shall we give for it? All that is ours. Why should we give it? For the sake of the trust. The original has no date, but it is in the spelling of the middle of the 17th century, remarked Musgrave. I am afraid, however, that it can be of little help to you in solving this mystery. At least, said I, it gives us another mystery, and one which is even more interesting than the first. It may be that the solution of the one may prove to be the solution of the other. You will excuse me, Musgrave, if I say that your butler appears to me to have been a very clever man, and to have had a clearer insight than 10 generations of his masters. I hardly follow you, said Musgrave. The paper seems to me to be of no practical importance. But to me it seems immensely practical, and I fancy that Brunton took the same view. He had probably seen it before that night on which you caught him. It is very possible. We took no pains to hide it. He simply wished, I should imagine, to refresh his memory upon that last occasion. He had, as I understand, some sort of map or chart which he was comparing with the manuscript, and which he thrust into his pocket when you appeared. That is true. But what could he have to do with this old family custom of ours, and what does this rigmarole mean? I don't think that we should have much difficulty in determining that, said I. With your permission, we will take the first train down to Sussex, and go a little more deeply into the matter upon the spot. The same afternoon saw us both at Hurlstone. Possibly you have seen pictures and road descriptions of the famous old building, so I will confine my accounts of it to saying that it is built in the shape of an L, the long arm being the more modern portion, and the shorter the ancient nucleus from which the other has developed. Over the low, heavy linteled door, in the center of this old part, is chiseled the date 1607, but experts are agreed that the beams and stonework are really much older than this. The enormously thick walls and tiny windows of this part had in the last century driven the family into business the new wing, and the old one was used now as a storehouse and cellar when it was used at all. A splendid park, which with fine old timber surrounded the house, and the lake on which my client had referred lay close to the avenue, about 200 yards from the building. I was already firmly convinced, Watson, that there were not 3 separate mysteries here, but one only, and that if I could read the Musgrave ritual aright, I should hold in my hand the clue which would lead me to the truth concerning both the butler Brunton and the maid Howells. To that, then, I turned all my energies. Why should the servant be so anxious to master his old formula? Evidently because he saw something in it which he had escaped all those generations of country squires, and from which he expected some personal advantage. What was it, then, and how had it affected his fate? It was perfectly obvious to me, on reading the ritual, that the measurements must refer to some spot to which the rest of the document alluded, and that if he could find that spot, we should be in a fair way towards the knowing that the secret was which the old Musgrave had thought it necessary to embalm in so curious a fashion. There were 2 guides given us to start with, an oak and an elm. As to the oak, there could be no question at all. Right in front of the house, upon the left-hand side of the drive, there stood a patriarch among oaks, one of the most magnificent trees that I have ever seen. That was there when your ritual was drawn. Was drawn up, said I, as we drove past it. It was there in the Norman Conquest, in all probability, he answered. It has a girth of 23 feet. Here was one of my fixed points secured. Have you any old elms? I asked. There used to be a very old one over yonder, but it was struck by lightning 10 years ago, and we cut down the stump. You can see where it used to be? Oh, yes. There are no other elms? No old ones, but plenty of beeches. I should like to see where it grew. We had driven up in a dog-cart, and my client led me away at once, without our entering the house, so the scar on the lawn where the elm had stood. It was nearly midway between the oak and the house. My investigation seemed to be progressing. "I suppose it is impossible to find out how high the elm was?" I asked. "I can give you it at once. It was 64 feet. "How do you come to know it?" I asked in surprise. "When my old tutor used to give me an exercise in trigonometry, it always took the shape of measuring heights. When I was a lad, I worked out every tree and building on the estate." This was an unexpected piece of luck. My data were coming more quickly than I could have reasonably hoped. "Tell me," I asked, "did your butler ever ask you such a question?" Reginald Musgrave looked at me in astonishment. "Now that you call it to my mind," he answered, "Brunton did ask me that about the height of the tree, some months ago in connection with some little argument with the groom." This was excellent news, Watson, for it showed me that I was on the right road. I looked up at the sun. It was low in the heavens, and I calculated that in less than an hour it would lie just above the topmost branches of the old oak. One condition mentioned in the ritual would be fulfilled, and the shadow of the elm must mean the further end of the shadows, otherwise the trunk would have been chosen as the guide. I had then to find where the far end of the shadow would fall when the sun was just clear of the oak. That must have been difficult, Holmes. When the elm was no longer there, well, at least I knew that if Brunton could do it, I also could. Besides, there was no real difficulty. I went with Musgrave to his study and whittled myself this peg, to which I tied this long string with a knot at each yard. Then I took 2 lengths of a fishing rod, which came to just 6 feet, and I went back with my client to where the elm had been. The sun was just grazing the top of the oak. I fastened the rod on one end, marked out the direction of the shadow, and measured it. It was 9 feet in length. Of course, the calculation now was a simple one. If a rod of 6 feet threw a shadow of 9 feet, a tree of 64 feet would throw one of 96 feet, and the line of the one would of course be the line of the other. I measured out the distance, which brought me almost to the wall of the house, and I thrust a peg into the spot. You can imagine my exultation, Watson, when within 2 inches of my peg I saw a conical depression in the ground. I knew that it was the mark made by Brunton in this measurement, and that I was still upon his trail. From this starting point I proceeded to step, having first taken the cardinal points by my pocket compass. 10 steps with each foot took me along parallel with the wall of the house, and again I marked my spot with a peg. Then I carefully paced off 5 to the east and 2 to the north. It brought me to the very threshold of the old door. 2 steps to the west meant now that I was to go 2 paces down the stone-flagged passage, and this was the place indicated by the ritual. Never have I felt such a cold chill of disappointment, Watson. For a moment it seemed to me that there must be some radical mistake in my calculations. The setting sun shone full upon the passage door, and I could see that the old foot-worn gray stones with which it was paved were firmly cemented together, and had certainly not been moved for many a long year. Brunton had not been at work here. I tapped upon the floor, but it sounded the same all over, and there was no sign of any crack or crevice. But fortunately Musgrave, who had begun to appreciate the meaning of my proceedings, and who was now as excited as myself, took out his manuscript to check my calculations. "And under!" he cried. "You have omitted the "and under." I had thought that it meant that we were to dig, but now of course I saw at once that I was wrong. "There was a cellar under this, then?" I cried. "Yes, and as old as the house, down here through the door." We went down a winding stone stair, and my companion, striking a match, lit a large lantern which stood on a barrel in the corner. In an instant it was obvious that we had at last come upon the true place, and that we had not been the only people to visit the spot recently. It had been used for the storage of wood, but the billets, which had evidently been littered upon over the floor, were now piled at the sides so as to leave a clear space in the middle. In this space lay a large and heavy flagstone with a rusted iron ring in the center, to which a thick shepherd's check muffler was attached. "By Jove!" cried my client, "that's Brunton's muffler. I have seen it on him and could swear to it. What has the villain been doing here?" At my suggestion, a couple of the country police were summoned to be present, and I had then endeavored to raise the stone by pulling on the cravat. I could only move it slightly, and it was with the aid of one of the constables that I succeeded at last in carrying it to one side. A black hole yawned beneath, into which we all peered, while Musgrave, kneeling at the side, pushed down the lantern. A small chamber about 7 feet deep and 4 feet square lay open to us. At one side of this was a squat brass-bound wooden box, the lid of which was hinged upwards, with this curious old-fashioned key projecting from the lock. It was furred outside by a thick layer of dust, and damp and worms had eaten through the wood, so that a crop of livid fungi was growing on the inside of it. Several discs of metal, old coins apparently, such as I hold here, were scattered over the bottom of the box, but it contained nothing else. At the moment, however, we had no thought for the old chest, for our eyes were riveted upon that which crouched beside it. It was the figure of a man, clad in a suit of black, who squatted down upon his hams with his forehead sunk upon the edge of the box, and his 2 arms thrown out on each side of it. The attitude had drawn all the stagnant blood to his face, and no man could have recognized this distorted, liver-colored countenance. But his height, his dress, and his hair were all sufficient to show my client, when we had drawn the body up, that it was indeed his missing butler. He had been dead some days, but there was no wound or bruise upon the person to show how he had met this dreadful end. When his body had been carried from the cellar, we found ourselves still confronted with a problem which was almost as formidable as that with which we had started. I confess that so far, Watson, I have been disappointed in my investigation. I had reckoned upon solving the matter when once I had found the place referred to in the ritual, but now I was there, and was apparently as far as ever from knowing what it was which the family had concealed with such elaborate precautions. It is true that I had thrown a light upon the fate of Brunton, but now I had to ascertain how that fate had come upon him, and what part had been played in the matter of the woman who had disappeared. I sat down upon a keg in the corner, and thought the whole matter carefully over. You know my methods in such cases, Watson. I put myself in the man's place, and having first gauged his intelligence, I tried to imagine how I should myself have proceeded under the same circumstances. In this case, the matter was simplified by Brunton's intelligence being quite first-rate, so that it was unnecessary to make any allowance for the personal equation, as the astronomers have dubbed it. He knew that something valuable was concealed. He had spotted the place. He found that the stone which covered it was just too heavy for a man to move unaided. What would he do next? He could not get help from outside, even if he had someone whom he could trust, without the unbarring of doors and considerable risk of detection. It was better, if he could, to have his helpmate inside the house, but whom could he ask? This girl had been devoted to him. A man always finds it hard to realize that he may have finally lost a woman's love, however badly he may have treated her. He would try by a few attentions to make his peace with the girl Howells, and then they would engage her as his accomplice. Together they would come at night in the cellar, and their united force would suffice to raise the stone. So far I could follow their actions as far as if I had actually seen them. But for two of them, and one a woman, it must have been heavy work in the raising of that stone. A burly Sussex policeman and I had found it no light job. What would they do to assist them? Probably what I should have done myself. I rose and examined carefully the different billets of wood which were scattered round the floor. Almost at once I came upon what I expected. One piece, about 3 feet in length, had marked indentation at one end, while several were flattened at the side as if they had been compressed by some considerable weight. Evidently they had dragged the stone up Evidently, as they had dragged the stone up, they had thrust the chunks of wood into the chink, until at last, when the opening was large enough to crawl through, they would hold it open by a billet placed lengthwise, which might very well become indented at the lower end, since the whole weight of the stone would press it down on to the edge of this other slab. So far I was still on safe ground. But now, how was I to proceed to reconstruct this midnight drama? Clearly only one could get into the hole, and that one was Brunton. The girl must have waited above. Brunton then unlocked the box, handed up the contents, presumably, since they were not to be found, and then what happened? What smoldering fire of vengeance had suddenly sprung into flame in this passionate Celtic woman's soul when she saw the man who had wronged her perhaps far more than we suspected, in her power? Was it a chance that the wood had slipped and that the stone had shut Brunton into what had become his sepulchre? Had she only been guilty of silence as to his fate? Or had some sudden blow from her hand dashed the support away and sent the slab crashing down into its place? Be that as it might, I seemed to see that woman's figure still clutching at her treasure trove and flying wildly up the winding stairs, with her ears ringing, perhaps with the muffled screams from behind her, and with the drumming of the frenzied hands against the slab of stone which was choking her faithless lover's life out. Here was the secret of her blanched face, her shaken nerves, her peals of hysterical laughter on the next morning. But what had been in the box? What had she done with that? Of course it must have been the old metal and pebbles which my client had dragged from the mere. She had thrown them in there at the first opportunity to remove the last trace of her crime. For 20 minutes I had sat motionless, thinking the matter out. Musgrave still stood with a very pale face, swinging his lantern and peering down into the hole. "These are the coins of Charles I," said he, holding out the few which had been left in the box. "You see we were right in fixing our date for the ritual." "We may find something else of Charles I," I cried, as the probable meaning of the first 2 questions of the ritual broke suddenly upon me. "Let me see the contents of the bag which you fished from the mere." We ascended to his study, and he laid the debris before me. I could understand his regarding it as of small importance when I looked at it, for the metal was almost black and the stone lustreless and dull. I rubbed one of them in my sleeve, however, and it glowed afterwards like a spark in the dark hollow of my hand. The metalwork was in the form of a double ring, but it had been bent and twisted out of its original shape. "You must bear in mind," said I, "that the royal party made head of England even after the death of the king, and that when they had last fled, they probably left many of their most precious possessions buried behind him, with the intention of returning for them in more peaceful times. My ancestor, Sir Ralph Musgrave was a prominent cavalier and the right-hand man of Charles II in his wandering, said my friend. Ah, indeed, I answered. Well, now I think that really should give us the last link in what we wanted. I must congratulate you on coming into the possession, though in rather a tragic manner, of a relic which is of great intrinsic value, but of even greater importance as an historical curiosity. What is it, then? He gasped in astonishment. It is nothing less than the ancient crown of the kings of England. The crown? Precisely. Consider what the ritual says. How does it run? Who was it? How does it run? Who was it? His own is gone. His who is gone. That was after the execution of Charles. Then who shall have it? He who will come. That was Charles II, whose advent was already foreseen. Then there can I think of no doubt that this battered and shapeless diadem once encircled the brows of the royal stewards. And how came it in the pond? Ah, that is a question which will take some time to answer, and with that I stretched out to him the whole long chain of surmise and of proof which I had constructed. The twilight had closed in, and the moon was shining brightly in the sky before my narrative was finished. And how was it, then, that Charles did not get his crown when he returned? Asked Musgrave, pushing back the relic into its linen bag. Ah, there you lay your fingers upon the one point which we shall probably never be able to clear up. It is likely that the Musgrave who held this secret died in the interval, and by some oversight left this guide to the descendant without explaining the meaning of it. From that day to this, it has been handed down from father to son, until at last it came within reach of a man who tore its secret out of it and lost his life in the venture. And that's the story of the Musgrave ritual, Watson. They have the crown down at Hurlstone, though they have some legal bother, and a considerable sum to pay before they were allowed to retain it. I am sure that if you mention my name, they would be happy to show it to you. Of the woman nothing was ever heard, and the probability is that she got away out of England, and carried herself, and the memory of her crime, to some land beyond the seas. All right, we have come to the end of that adventure, so I'm going to go ahead and end the stream here. I'm not going to do a gaming stream right after. I may do one tonight. I may continue with more Quest of Dungeons. But tomorrow, 2 to 4, same as always, I'm going to be continuing with Wizard of Oz with some new artwork, and which I hope you'll enjoy. Anyways, thanks for hanging out with me, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good day.